Hey guys, so this is an activity that we're going to be working on to go over everyone's favorite subject, plagiarism. I'm sure you've talked about plagiarism before in previous classes, but one of the reasons that I talk about it now is because as we're starting the annotated bibliography, one of the things that people do often realize that they hadn't realized before is that you can plagiarize accidentally, and that there's actually a lot of gray area to think about. So we're going to be talking about plagiarism and a few of the ways that people sometimes plagiarize without realizing that they are even doing it. A couple of our goals for this are just going to be to understand concepts of plagiarism a little bit better. Understand that we're going to go over the two key ways people plagiarize most often, by patchworking and by paraphrasing correctly. We're going to practice paraphrasing a little bit also. And then later in, not this activity, but in the next activity, we're going to be talking about the annotated bibliography and some of those requirements and doing some brainstorming. I guess to get started, one of the first things that you have to, understand is that plagiarism means different things in different places. It's not a universal sort of concept that everybody understands the same way. The way that we define it here has a lot to do with the fact that in Western cultures we really value things like ownership and individuality. And it's not necessarily the same everywhere. We really feel like once you have said something, this is your idea, this is your study, this is research you conducted yourself, that now you own it. And it would be disrespectful for someone to use it without your crediting that to you, which isn't necessarily the same everywhere. In some other cultures, the focus of the writing is more on the product and how lovely the writing is and how knowledgeable the writer seems, and it's not necessarily considered disrespectful to pull that knowledge from other places without giving it credit. So one of the things to think about is that kind of across the board, people do still kind of talk about plagiarism in different ways and have some different concepts about what counts. So one thing to remember, and you should definitely write this down because this could save you later. In an instructional setting, plagiarism should be something that should only be considered plagiarism if it's deliberate. You copied and pasted these words or this idea and made no attempt to cite it, versus you use this information, you tried to cite it and it was incorrect, maybe it was missing a piece of information. That's considered a misuse of sources. So that's one thing to kind of think about, is that plagiarism should be very clear that you have tried to make the other person think that this idea or this wording is yours. And I have over the years heard from students cases where people felt like they had been accused of plagiarism when in fact it was more of a misuse of sources. So that is something just kind of to keep in mind for the future, for your future classes and your future research. So I do want to talk about some of the reasons why you should be thinking about citing sources correctly, why it's so important. There's a couple of really good academic reasons why you would want to do that. One is because it shows that you are knowledgeable and it shows that you are credible. If you take away that responsible research, that concern for meeting that academic expectation, it takes away some of your credibility. If people can see your sources, it also shows that you have demonstrated fairness, because people can actually see what other points of view you have considered. And it's going to help them see that whole conversation. One of the differences is with academic writing is that your writing should always be placed in a conversation that readers can see happening in your work. It should never seem one-sided or seem in like you're writing in a vacuum. People should be able to kind of see what other people are talking about, because of the way that you've integrated and talked about your sources. And it's going to help readers kind of follow your thoughts. So I want to really quickly show you this example of what I mean by helping readers kind of follow your thoughts. And it also kind of helps readers kind of see a chain where they see where you're using sources in your paper, and then they could go read more about them if they wanted to. The main idea being that when you have these in-text citations in your paper, that it lets people know where you're pulling in something that isn't you in your paper, where you're pulling in a new voice. And then they could identify where this point was made by this author, and then they could go to the Works Cited page and find the information for that source, and they could read more about it. So to wrap up this little intro to plagiarism, I want to cover just a couple of things that you kind of differentiate between like what needs to be cited and what doesn't, because there is some gray area. There's some stuff that's pretty obvious. Most people know direct quotations, like within quotations, you have to cite it. Paraphrasing gets a little tricky because I think a lot of people know that if you're paraphrasing a big chunk of information, you're supposed to cite it and have an in-text citation. But a lot of people don't know that even if it's a couple of, like even if it's a phrase that you paraphrase, like one sentence, you still need to have an in-text citation for that. And even if you're summarizing or quickly referencing a source, even if it's brief or a note, you would still put that in your Works Cited page. So everything, every reference does need to be cited. Facts that are not widely known, claims that are arguable, that people usually know. Like if it's someone's debatable point, if their idea, their opinion, you are referencing it, or if it's information that's like obscure that your readers might not know, then you would want to cite that. The facts not widely known, especially just so your reader can go read more about that if they want to. And then, of course, help provided by others. Stuff you don't need to cite is stuff like common knowledge. Like if I were talking about 9/11, we know, so I wouldn't necessarily need to cite where I got that information from, especially if it was general kind of information that had been in the news a lot. This is where it gets tricky. Ideas available in a wide variety of sources. I've had people ask before, like, or say, like, I don't know where to cite this from because I read it here, I read it here, I read it here. If it's something that's like a news event that's being covered by a lot of people, that's not necessarily something you would need to cite just to talk about that event, because it's nobody's original idea. It's an event that happened, a fact, and you could read about it in a lot of different places. So things like that aren't necessarily things that you would need to cite. If you have to wonder where to cite it from, it's probably not something that you need to cite. And then, of course, all your own like findings and things like that. It does get tricky because language counts too. So, for example, so it's ideas and language. If you did want to talk about an event and you read about it in several different places, but you used one reporter's specific wording to talk about that event, now you do need to cite that because their language counts. Even though it's not just their original idea, it is their original language if you directly quoted them. And so we're going to move on to the first way that people do sometimes run into problems when they're trying to talk about sources, integrate information, where plagiarism can happen accidentally, and that is paraphrasing. So I want to do what might be a quick review for you, if it is, hang in there. So the three different ways we integrate outside material, which is basically stuff not from your own head, into your paper. One is quoting, which we use to write to repeat. We should do it kind of rarely in writing. We do want to focus on paraphrasing, but we'll talk more about that later. That's just where you're trying to present words unchanged from the original. You put quotations around it and you cite it, obviously. I have paraphrasing and summarizing highlighted because those are the two ways that people get into trouble the most, and those are the two things that we're going to be doing in your annotated bibliography. So paraphrasing is more writing to translate. It serves two purposes. It's when you are trying to keep the ideas intact of the writer, but change the wording so it matches either your style, the style of the paper that you're writing, or you're trying to put it into layman's terms, okay? Because if you see a whole bunch of like quote after quote after quote in different styles, it just gets really confusing. So you wouldn't necessarily need quotations around that, but you would still need to cite it and have an internal citation and a citation on your, not for your annotated bibliography, of course, but you would, if this were a paper, you would need it in your Works Cited section. Summarizing is where you're trying to condense, and that is something we're also doing in the annotated bibliography. It's still paraphrasing a little bit because it is in your own words, but you're presenting that information, but trying to boil it down. So you might be taking like instead of, with paraphrasing where you've got maybe one excerpt and what you paraphrase is going to be relatively the same length. A summary would be when you're referencing a whole article or a whole section and you're trying to boil it down to like just a few sentences. So one of the key ways that paraphrasing can be so tricky is because you're trying to rephrase someone else's ideas into your own words, your own sentence patterns, your own style. The problem is that's easier said than done. And we have a lot of misconceptions, I think, about what actually paraphrasing is for and what makes a good paraphrase. We do tend to know that word choice should be different. The problem is what people end up doing is using a thesaurus or just switching out a few words, and that's actually a poor paraphrase. And if you submitted that for a class and your instructor ran that through a plagiarism checker, that's going to pop back as being really similar to the original information, and it's very likely going to get you deemed plagiarism. Two other things actually that have to be different are these. So there's two things that have to be different: word choice, of course, but also sentence structure and the order of ideas should sound like the style you're writing that paper in. Should sound like it's coming from your head. It shouldn't sound like the words and the style of the original writer, and that can be really, really hard. And here's why. Because it's really hard to find a better way to say something when you're staring at the original. And a lot of times the mistake that we make is that we didn't read the excerpt or the material that we're using enough that we could just talk about it. And that's really what paraphrasing should be. You just talking about it in your own words. But if you've copied and pasted something and you haven't read it, you don't understand it really well, you couldn't just talk to me about it without being able to look at it. It's going to be really difficult for you to paraphrase it. That's one of the reasons that paraphrasing is so, one of the reasons it's so favored by instructors is because it shows that you know what you're talking about. And if you were just sitting around talking about this issue with another person, you would just talk from your own head. And that's kind of the goal, is that you're not having to stare at the original and try to figure out a better way to say it, because you know it well enough that you don't need to do that. So the goal is always to understand the material first and then try to do it without looking at it, and then come back to it and make sure you have a signal phrase, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and attach a citation, however short the paraphrase might be at the end, so we know where the paraphrase starts and stops, and then you check it to make sure that everything is accurate. This is a paraphrase that is entirely too close. If you look, you can see where, sorry, that jumped ahead a little bit. You can see where certain words were changed, like rise, increase, let's see, expansion, sorry, it just keeps jumping around. Expansion becomes explosion. But you can tell, like, if you're looking at it, that it's too similar. The sentence structure isn't different. It's basically the exact same thing, except that they just could have just like right-clicked and used the thesaurus, which you shouldn't do, because you're probably not going to pick the best word, and it's going to sound awkward. When people try to paraphrase this way, like, this one sounds good, this one sounds awkward. So you can usually kind of tell that way. And here is another example of one that's too close, and I use this one for a couple of different reasons. My face over here. One, because it's true, and because we're going to practice with it. So the original says, students frequently overuse direct quotations in taking notes, and as a result, they overuse quotations in the final research paper. Probably only about 10% of your final manuscript should appear as directly quoted matter. Therefore, you should strive to limit the amount of exact transcribing of source materials while taking notes. It's not a formula, but it's kind of true. Like, people do tend to quote way too much when they're in their final drafts of their papers, and usually that's because what we were kind of talking about before, people aren't kind of internalizing the information, just sort of like copying things down verbatim. So you put too much of it in your paper and have too many similarities in the paper. So if you're, I'm like reading closely and taking notes more in your own words, that's not going to happen. Also, it's usually that true that about maybe 50% or more of your paper should be from you. It should be your own examples, questions, your own commentary, and then your sources are there to sort of support what you're saying, but probably 2/3 of that material should be paraphrased, and you want to keep quoting down to just what's necessary. So roughly, I mean, somewhere between like 10 and 20% would be a solid amount of quotes. You should probably try to keep it down to somewhere around that level. Again, it's not a formula. It's just if you're noticing like quote, 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 quote on one page, then you're probably doing way too much of it. So this is, again, way too close because students often use too many. And when they take notes, and you can see like everything that's still in the purple font is, the original. Red is just synonyms that were added in. And then blue is just a transition that kind of got thrown in there. But it's the only thing that's actually new wording. For the most part, everything is still really too close. What I'm actually going to have you do is try this activity in your notebook. We're going to look at the previous excerpt. So if we go back to this slide, you're going to look. So I have to pause and kind of go back. Is look at this, the original that I have here. What I want you to do is try without looking at it to paraphrase what it says. And it's a good way to check because when you're done, you can look back and see if you actually included all the main points and see if it sounds too similar. And you can kind of understand what I mean where if you're looking at this and reading it, you have to really pay attention to what it says. So they're kind of making 3 main points that people quote too much in their paper. Should be about 10%. So if you take more notes in your own words, then it's going to turn out better. So I want you to pause, take 5 minutes to try to paraphrase that in your own words in a couple of sentences, and then we'll move on. So one of the things hopefully you notice from trying that out is that if you didn't really remember and understand the excerpt yourself before you started to write it, if you didn't internalize it, it was kind of hard. And that's an important part of writing with sources. And likewise, you probably noticed if you did try to look at the original while you were writing it, how hard it was to think of a new way to say it. And I want to show you one way that you could do this. Is a little bit more formal, but here's one kind of good paraphrase. In research papers, students often rely on quotes, failing to keep quoted material down to a desirable level. Since the problem usually originates during note-taking, it is essential to minimize material recorded verbatim and instead take notes in your own words. So that example is a little bit more formal, but it hits the main points that they want to make. And a good rule of thumb that you can use to look back at the one you practice is that if you could color code it the way I did these, then it's already too close. If you can actually pick out, like, here are the things that I changed, then you know it's too close. In this one of the things that you can tell makes it a good paraphrase is that there's no way I could tell exactly what I changed because, again, like word choice, order of ideas and sentence structure. Everything is different. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the second problem area, which is patchworking. And patchworking is something that sometimes happens intentionally, sometimes happens accidentally. I've seen it happen accidentally, especially in the annotated bibliography. It's where you didn't actually write the material. It was more pieced together from a lot of locations. Sometimes it might have happened to you if you've been in a hurry writing a paper before. Freelance writers do this all the time. I go online and copy from here and paste it, copy from here and paste it, copy from this source, put it all in the paper. Then you have a lot of copied material, copied and pasted, and so of course, some of that's supposed to be yours, but a lot of times what happens is that people will just move it around and reword some of it, cite some of it, but again, you didn't actually write. It's called patchworking because it's actually sewing together a paper from other places instead of writing it yourself. I'm going to show you an example of what this looks like through Turnitin. We don't use Turnitin anymore. We use VeriCite, but I like Turnitin better. This is an example of how this would spit back. You can tell by looking at this paper that pretty much everything is highlighted, and none of these are number one. But the closer, the further you move down, the more original it gets. But you could tell, like, a lot of this was just paraphrased from other places. It reads very much like a superficial kind of report, information I could have gotten anywhere. And a lot of it was just copied and pasted and kind of reworded. And it's not this author's essay that they wrote. It's an essay that they pieced together. This is what it looks like in an annotated bibliography. So this is the assignment you're working on. Bibliographic citation, summary. Oh, sorry, I did it again. Summary, evaluations. Those are your three main parts. And if you look at the summary, you'll notice all the similarities are from one place. Very likely a summary or abstract, or even maybe in annotated bibliographies, the way it happens is that rather than writing a summary, people will copy what they think is the thesis statement and a couple of main points, copy and paste that into their summary, and then try to reword it, and that would be something that would need to be redone. This is a myth that I would like to dispel, just because I've heard it before, where people have been told that this percentage of similarity is what matters. As long as the whole paper is 60% similar, is cool. That's actually not true. You could have a 98% originality, 60% originality, 80% originality, and that's still just looking at the big picture. But if you have one sentence that's copied and pasted from somewhere and it's not cited, that's plagiarism, regardless of how perfectly done the rest of the paper is. It very much is about respecting the convention and crossing your T's and dotting your I's, and just making sure that you are paying attention to that. Not to be scary, but I mean, the details are what matter, not the big picture of the whole paper when it comes to whether or not you've cited everything correctly. So I do want to end by saying, like, this is something that we're going to practice through our assignments. When it comes to whether or not something counts as plagiarism, it's up to each kind of individual instructor to determine how to handle things like plagiarism versus a misuse of sources. This class is a writing class, so citations are something that we're practicing. So unless something is very deliberate plagiarism, it would be something that you would need to redo. I would just tell you that I can't, accept it. Here's where, things went wrong, and have you fix it. But this is more of a place to practice and to necessarily worry about getting in trouble for a misuse of sources. The only thing that you would get in trouble for is something like blatant plagiarism. So I just want to kind of clarify the way we're going to handle it in this class. So this is more of a practice space to prepare you for when you are going to have to deal with this in your future classes.